so promptly after lunch. It's nice to see you again. We're doing a little bit of furniture rearrangements, but it is quarter to two. So on the agenda, we're going to go back online to a short video from Thomas. And Thomas is the, as we said very briefly at the beginning of the day, Thomas is the Assistant Country Director for CARE, currently in Turkey. We have Thomas also online, but as a backup, we had Thomas record the video first, and then like we did with Leon this morning, we'll have some Q&A. We'll have some Q&A after that, if the line continues. So without further ado, I will manage this technically so that people in the room and online will be able to see the pre-recording.
Hello, my name is Tom Bamforth and I'm Assistant Country Director for CARE Türkiye. And I'd like to bring to the discussion today of doing more with less a perspective from northwest Syria. And in northwest Syria, there are about 4.5 million people who live in siege-like conditions and who are trapped between a front line and also a border wall with Turkey. And they live in what you might call siege-like conditions. There are about 1.9 million people who live in IDP camps, of those 4.5 million people, and they live in about 1,400 IDP sites. And these are sites which are spontaneously settled, self-settled. They don't have utilities, they don't have access to running water or sanitation. As you can see from the picture, people are still in emergency or makeshift shelter. And many of the people who live in IDP sites are children. About 58% of people living in the IDP sites are children. And so when people suggest that we can do more with less in humanitarian contexts, I think my first answer to this is that you do less with less. And some have argued that there is money in the system, but as anyone who's worked in an underfunded emergency knows, when the money runs out, when it runs short, then you have to start making some pretty critical decisions about who gets assistance and what kind of assistance is available. So when we talk about some of these mantras of humanitarian assistance, things like Build Back Better, resilient programming and so on, in the end, I think what happens when there's a lack of funding, when you're forced to try to do more with less, you end up building back worse, essentially. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the humanitarian context in northwest Syria. And so in those sites, in those 1,400 IDP sites, there are very, very significant ongoing humanitarian needs. And these have been the same or very similar for the last 12 years. So in northwest Syria, there are 2.7 million people who need humanitarian assistance. There are 3.3 million people who rely on food assistance. There are 1.9 million people living in the IDP sites. There are 800,000 people living in very old and often disintegrating tents. 500,000 people, mainly women, access GBV services in the last year, and 71,000 infants aged 3 to 6 months rely on UN-funded nutrition programs for survival. So these are a fairly bewildering and difficult to grasp range of statistics. But the underlying point is that there is a critical need for humanitarian assistance and an ongoing need in northwest Syria. And so threats to cut assistance, and this has happened and this continues to happen, really undermine the ability of NGOs and assistance agencies to get assistance to people who are in desperate need of it. So the question of doing more with less, well, we do this every year in a contingency planning exercise because assistance to northwest Syria is dependent on a UN Security Council resolution. And so every 6 months, in fact, that comes up for renewal, and every 6 months we have to go through a contingency planning exercise which looks specifically about what would happen if we don't have the resolution, and therefore have to do more with less and try and meet these overwhelming humanitarian needs with significantly less resources that would otherwise have been provided through the UN agencies and the wider UN system. And the consequence of this kind of contingency planning is really very alarming. If there's no resolution, there's no additional assistance, then what that means is that different sectors have to reduce targets. So all of those infants who require additional nutrition programs, those programs would have to be cut. People who require shelter programs, emergency shelter programs, well, that would have to be cut as well. Longer term programs would also have to be cut. So we'd go from being in a position to implement some longer term programs to having to cut those and provide only basic services to fewer people. There would be fewer wash programs, and this is in a context where there's a cholera outbreak, and more than 100,000 people across Syria have already been diagnosed formally as having cholera. But if we have no resolution, if we have to try and do more with less, then we reach fewer people, and the risk of those cholera outbreaks begins to escalate. We move into water trucking rather than water networking, and only to fewer sites and fewer people. So the impact of doing more with less is basically that you do less, and also that you exacerbate existing and underlying humanitarian conditions. There's also the problem of inefficient and ineffective cycle of long-term humanitarian assistance. So I estimate, and this is solely for one sector, this is in the shelter sector, that over the course of 10 years of humanitarian crisis in northwest Syria, the international community has invested around about $750 million, or up to $1 billion in emergency assistance. But what you get for that, because of the short time frame of humanitarian assistance, is what's in the picture. You get people who are reliant on ongoing humanitarian assistance. You get assistance that isn't ultimately fit for purpose. You get people, many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people living in these IDP sites with a lack of services. And after a while, this creates another problem, the creation of a problem of underinvestment in the system. And then there's more investment is required to address the consequences of initial underinvestment and initial short-term planning. So there's an inefficiency in the system. So one of the things that we argue for is the need for a different approach to humanitarian programming, and this is especially the case in protracted crises, that there needs to be more of a developmental approach. Unfortunately, one of the things that we've discovered is that because of the way the system's set up, it's very difficult to introduce longer-term approaches, longer-term timeframes, longer-term horizons into humanitarian programming. And as a consequence of that, humanitarian agencies have been very creative in a way of finding ways around some of the restrictions that are placed on them by donors, by the system, by policymakers, by the conditions of particular contracts between donors and NGOs and so on. And there's been constructive or strategic or creative ambiguity, as some people call this, in order to try to manipulate the programs to have longer term ends in a context where only short-term outcomes are generally allowable. So one of these areas is the idea that we should start off with longer-term planning and longer-term investment, so that if we're working in contexts of protracted displacement, instead of going through this regular process of repeat emergency response as we do in northwest Syria, then we begin to make some investments which will last in the longer term. There's some element of, for example, site planning, as you can see in the picture here, to improve the conditions of sites, drainage and roads, and the introduction of sewage networks and water systems, using better shelters in order to provide people with more dignified places to live and places that will provide greater protection. This also allows a more integrated response, more integrated services, and the ability of these services to reinforce each other. So if you have water and sanitation and shelter and water systems and electricity, if you have health clinics and schools, if you have a place where markets can occur, then these sorts of things, and they all begin to reinforce each other. And so you move beyond a short-term, very siloed approach to humanitarian assistance, which I suppose is what we have at the moment, to something that's much more longer term and much more integrated and ultimately much more planned. And if we consider that most people, especially in conflict, are displaced for well over 20 years now, it makes sense at the beginning of a crisis, or even into a crisis, to begin to think about what longer term options may be to ensure that basic living standards are met in these contexts of protracted displacement. And so in this context of creative or strategic or constructive ambiguity, where we're trying to make arguments using different types of language in order to introduce longer-term developmental approaches into a system that's only designed for short-term approaches, one of the questions that people often come back to in the context in which I work is the concept of dignity. And so we think of some of the standards that are available to us as humanitarian responders. We think of some of the policies and the frameworks within which we respond. And we can implement within the parameters of those frameworks and those policies and those contractual limitations and so on. But the fundamental question that everyone is beginning to ask is a bigger question of whether or not this provides dignity. Does this ultimately provide life with dignity? And in that context, people are beginning to reframe some of the discussion, some of the proposals, in order to ensure that they are sufficiently ambiguous to fall within humanitarian funding parameters, but also begin to address longer term needs. And this concept of dignity, and the question that we have to ask ourselves is that, are any of our interventions ultimately contributing to this ultimate goal of life with dignity? So we have to ask ourselves this question, and we have to make sure that we're able to stretch the limitations of the humanitarian system in order to be able to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas. And I hope that we have Thomas online. Oh, we did have, but it seems to have disappeared. So Thomas may or may not get his connectivity back, but we're nearly at 2 o'clock. Thomas may or may not get his connectivity back, but it's nearly 2 o'clock, so I'm very happy to introduce the next session, which is a discussion. As you see, we've changed our seating arrangement so that I'd like to invite on stage 3 discussants today, and there will be 1 person also online contributing. So we have Professor David Alexander from UCL. We have Dr. Maria Kett from UCL, and also Dr. James Smith. And online we have Stuart Kefford, who's joining us from the Resident Coordinator's office in Turkey. And you'll find all of the profiles online in full, but also David will take it from here. Thank you so much, David.
Right, we can, yes,
You're welcome to have a later.
use the microphone. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had a wonderful lunch. The Titanic is much in the news at the moment, and it reminded me that decades ago, the impresario Lou Grade spent a huge amount of money on a film called Raise the Titanic. It was a complete flop, a financial disaster movie. He ended up commenting ruefully, raise the Titanic, it would have been cheaper to lower the Atlantic. Well, that was one behemoth that went off the rails, but what about the humanitarian world? Vast amounts of money are spent on it. Does it work? What's wrong with it? What's right with it? What needs to be encouraged? What needs to be suppressed? We're going to have a discussion about that, and I'm very fortunate to be able to introduce 3 top-notch discussants, starting with Dr. Maria Kett, who is Associate Professor of Humanitarianism and Disability at UCL in the Institute for Epidemiology and Healthcare. And Maria has much experience in Africa and Asia of disability research in the context of disasters and conflict situations. She is a social anthropologist by training and has worked in at least a dozen countries and also sits on a number of influential committees. On screen, we have Stuart Kefford, who is joining us from Geneva. And Stuart is Senior Advisor to the Humanitarian and resident coordinator in Turkey, and part of the UN Resident Coordinator's Office. He has much experience of humanitarian work in many parts of the world, from North Korea to South Sudan, Kosovo, Ethiopia, Afghanistan, and much more. 20 years in hard field situations. He's also worked as a civilian advisor to NATO, managed UNICEF's South Sudan Child Soldier Rehabilitation Program, and worked with child soldier problems in Afghanistan. He has a master's degree in development studies as well. And finally, Dr. James Smith, who is a physician and has almost a decade of experience working in humanitarian health situations. Nothing could be more important than health, most notably with Médecins Sans Frontières. And he is now with UCL in the Humanitarian Policy and Practice, being Deputy Director of the upcoming MSc program with the same title. Welcome, everyone. And we've much to discuss. First, I'd like to ask you what you think about the state of the humanitarian system. If we did a SWOT analysis on it in 5 minutes, where would we get? Maria, would you like to start?
Oh, God. Where shall I start? I guess I want to pick up something that Thomas said, which he talks about the existing system exacerbates existing inequalities. And I think that's really important to underscore that. You know, we've heard a lot about doing more with less. And I guess from my perspective and the work I've done with people with disabilities, you know, we already know that people with disabilities and other groups are already left behind. And unfortunately, when there's less resources and less money, they're even more likely to be left out and left behind. And we've seen that in, you know, even in Ukraine, where there's a significant amount of funding available. So I guess that would be my SWOT analysis. No, it exacerbates existing inequalities. Until we address that, I guess we're a bit going to be having the same discussion.
Stuart, do you agree?
Yeah, I do agree with that. And maybe coming back to your main question, what's the state of the humanitarian system? This is measured. So ALNAP actually do report. I think it's every 4 years they sort of they track whether the system is getting better at delivery, more efficient, better leadership, all these metrics. And the last one, I think the last one was maybe 2 years ago when it was published, but rather disappointingly, their assessment was it's not getting better. So it's not in a good shape at the moment. And back to you.
Thank you. James, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, when we had our briefing ahead of this call, I sort of described myself as a bit of a humanitarian nihilist. And I will try and avoid being too nihilistic, but I would say that the weaknesses are many. They are reflected in if we follow the money in the way that colleagues from development initiatives asked us to this morning. This is a sector that is beholden to geopolitical interests, that is skewed away from needs, and that in many places arguably causes more harm than good on balance. And I think too few people are, as of yet, having that conversation or conversations like this. The question really is, I mean, I suppose those of us who are here are hopeful that this is a system that can change. And there you see that debate drawn out between the sort of the reformists and the radicals or the revolutionaries, so to speak, who would imagine something arguably entirely different to the system that we have at present, and that we may not yet have a good conceptualization of.
But if I knew nothing about it, and perhaps I don't know enough about it anyway, but do any of us ever know enough about really complex worldwide things? But I would ask, why is the system skewed away from needs? Surely looking after needs is what it's all about, what it's there for.
You're looking at me for that one, aren't you? I'd also underscore, in addition to need, we also have to bring the focus back to rights as well, actually. They're sometimes a bit unpopular in terminologies, but I think, you know, it's important to remember that, of course, we're focused on need, and that's absolutely right, but we also need to think about the rights to people to get their needs met. And I think it's really important to remember that these are things that are in international humanitarian law, etc. So I think that's something really important. Sometimes it's around having a lack of information or data, or, we heard a lot this morning about the data gaps. And I guess that's something, certainly, for example, from a disability perspective, we haven't had, there's already huge gaps, so imagine if we're trying to get information about people with disabilities, that's another gap to add on to the existing gaps. And there can be challenges around collecting the data, but I wonder if it's a good enough, it's tempering this balance between having the evidence, having the data, and addressing needs and rights. And I guess I'm curious to explore some of the different ways we might do that in a system, as James said, that the current structures maybe aren't so effective, but how could we make them more effective?
Surely there is also no doubt that people with disabilities represent about 1 in 7 people in society, something like that. So, Stuart, are we moving away from R2P, responsibility to protect? Are we moving away from human rights? Are they being ditched?
Interesting question. You set the frame with, aren't we here for the needs? And I think we should be. But I'm going to take a little bit of a journey back for quite a long time. When I started my career, which was more than 20 years ago, and even a little bit before that, let's say, it wasn't the most professional of establishments, if you like. We were there because we wanted to help people. I think the desire was there, and absolutely we were there to try to address the needs. And we did it in a little bit of a haphazard manner. And then it sort of became a very sort of a multi-million-dollar industry, multi-billion-dollar now. I think it's more than $30 billion per year for humanitarian assistance now. And as we moved forward, I think we made a lot of attempts to try to professionalize. We've been through 3 versions of humanitarian reform. There's one with the clusters, 2006 or something, and then we moved forward to around about 2011, I think it was, with what we called the sort of transformative agenda. And then we've had the World Humanitarian Summit in Hamburg in 2016. So we've moved forward a lot, and we've tried to professionalize through all these reforms. And I think we have brought in a lot of professional systems. But with this, we've also brought in more money, more structure, more business. And as we've become more business-like, from my personal feeling here, we have become agencies, individual agencies have become more driven by trying to bring money into their own agency and try to market themselves as a success story. And that means their success is measured by how much money they bring into the organization. And when I say the success is measured, that's the head of UNICEF, for example, or the head of UNHCR, the head of an agency. When their success in a country, or they have to, they're measured for their next promotion, they're measured by how much money they've brought into the agency, not by how many people have helped. And this for me is a little bit of a problem, because this has now driven such a competitive environment that it's actually separating agencies from working together to help people, needs driven. And it's become a system based on business principles where we are trying to make as much money as possible for each agency. More money into a country is surely going to help, but it's not really helping coordination. It's separating the coordinated approach and increasing competition between agencies. And that's impeding our ability to help as a UN system, plus NGOs, plus the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. And this, I think, is a bit of an issue. We are still here for the needs, but I think competition that's been brought into the market is undermining our ability to work together to address them efficiently. And this comes back to the question that we have in mind, how to do more with less, driving efficiency. So yeah, this is something to work on, I do believe.
James, have you seen this in the field? Have you been trying to do more with less?
I think every humanitarian organization has been trying to do more with less, almost entirely unsuccessfully, I would suggest. One thing that struck me today, and I had to step away, so I may have missed some of this, but I wonder if we need to yet dwell on this question of having less. And I wonder whether not just the humanitarian sector, but as engaged civil society, as concerned individuals, however you would want to describe us folk, accepted less, as opposed to really sort of pushing back and attempting to resist that. And that may seem like an almost impossible task in the current political climate, certainly in the UK context, the situation with funding through the FCDO, for example, at the moment. But that is reflective of, beyond the UK context, of a broader neglect, a broader isolationism that has taken root. And I think humanitarian organizations are witnessing, and people are experiencing themselves, the very sharp end of that. Humanitarian funding, of course, won't solve all of those problems, but I do feel that there needs to be a much more concerted pushback against the notion of less, the political construction of less, and I don't think we're there yet.
Why are we seeing less? Is this a failure of philanthropy, or is it simply a landslide in need? A huge increase in the amount of need. What do you think?
Oh gosh. I think it's all of those things really, isn't it? I think we heard a lot this morning about, geopolitical, the whole sort of aid structure and the way the funding is being allocated, and certainly, alignments with different groups. And I guess I think that you already started to talk about this, in a way, as we've got better at delivering aid, we know what we need, but maybe we have got less, associating that with the cost. There's a higher need, more people, more crises, longer crises. We've heard all of this already. So in a way, we're getting better at responding to that, but that comes at a cost. And I guess that's the dilemma. And I don't know that we have the solution yet, but maybe Stuart has a thought about that.
You ever thought about that, Stuart? And also, what do the big agencies think? UNDRR, UNHCR, ECHO, and all of those. How do they see this situation? Do they really see it as a crisis?
They do see it as a crisis, but let me go back to your first point when you said, why are we seeing less? We have to sort of recognize that we're not seeing less in terms of money. Money is coming in more and more each year. The funding increases each year, but it's not keeping pace with the increasing needs. So we are getting more, but we have to use that little bit more money to address a lot more needs. And this is where it becomes a difficult one to deal with. Agencies are concerned about this. I'm not sure they're responding in exactly the right way. So whenever there's an emergency, we do have a flash appeal or sort of a humanitarian response plan or something like this. And generally speaking, the UN agencies that drive this process identify the needs and then sort of multiply it by 2 because they recognize they'll only get 50% funding for it. And that's an appeal that does well. I'm not too sure that's the right way to do it. If you do it another way, you will get left behind, that's for sure. But I think there's a creeping level of dishonesty that's coming into the system. The other question I want to sort of bring up as well is what being asked to do more with less. And we're being asked to do more in many different ways. We're being asked to do more simply because there's more people. There's more people affected by crisis. That's a statistical accuracy. But we're also being asked to do more in terms of creeping beyond the core humanitarian mandate. We're being asked to sort of look at human rights. We're being asked to look at disaster risk reduction. We're being asked to look at things which perhaps in the past have been more considered to be development rather than humanitarian. And this is creeping in. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, as James was saying earlier, sort of we're talking about this nexus. I think it was in the previous discussion as well. Sort of trying to work on humanitarian issues, but also address development angles at the same time. This is what disaster risk reduction is all about. So the narrative is there. We've got ideas of how to do more with less, but the practical implementation of delivering the nexus or connecting the development side of things or the peace building side of things. With the humanitarian agenda on the ground in countries, that's very, very weakly done. And this is the critical problem. On the positive side, the conversation's there, but the conversation, to be honest, has been there since the 1990s. We talked about LRRD, linking relief and rehabilitation and development, back in the 90s. We talk about the nexus now, but this is 25, 30 years of talking about the same things, but we've still failed to actually deliver this with any sort of great vigor on the ground. And that's a bit of a problem. So yeah, the discussion's there, but it's still a little bit trapped in a sort of a policy type of environment in the corridors of Geneva and the academic institutions around. But it's not being translated into field operations at the country level, and it's a concern. That's enough for me on this one. I'll come back later.
James, you're a very practical person. How do we get the policy into the field? Help.
I don't think I'm probably the least practical person on the panel. I'm just flighty ideas that I think I need to be brought back down to earth. I think so. So for me, it's about interdisciplinarity. It's about connecting with colleagues working far beyond the humanitarian sector. I was struck when we were doing the round of introductions this morning that within the Humanitarian Institute that there are colleagues from IR and so on that have joined us. That to me seems integral, to moving from policy rhetoric to very tangible action and change. And a quote that I sort of come back to repeatedly and that came to mind again just now was by a senior UN official whose name I now can't remember, but this was in the 90s, saying that there are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian problems. And then Tom Scott Smith, academic in Oxford, he went further and said there are no humanitarian problems. And what he sort of implied by that is that we are limiting the sort of options that we can think about, the sort of solutions, we can think about when we frame things as humanitarian problems. I think humanitarian organizations, as has been mentioned, have already been asked to sort of take on more and more. Often that is done very poorly by humanitarian organizations that are working beyond their natural remit. I think what we need is policy conversations between humanitarian organizations who are working with people who are experiencing often extreme violence, exclusion, and suffering, and to encourage those organizations to use that to advocate for accelerated policy change. And again, there's not enough of that happening. The humanitarian advocacy space is really patchy at best.
So to what extent does humanitarianism actually perpetuate what's going on in the field, these terribly bad things?
I mean, I start off by saying that I think it does perpetuate inequalities. And I think just to pick up a couple of points that James and Stuart have said, for example, I've talked about disability inclusion. We've had a United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities for 20 years now. And certainly within the humanitarian sector, there are guidelines, resources, there's ISE guidelines on disability inclusion. So, it's certainly, compared to where we were 2 decades. Certainly compared to where we were 20 years ago, I think that from a disability perspective, from persons with disabilities perspective, there is much more visible attempt to be more inclusive in our efforts. But I guess that also drives up, competition, and we start this, tick women, tick older adults, tick children, and it becomes a bit of a tick box of who we are trying to address. And I think that just perpetuates this kind of competition. Having said all of that, I don't think disability inclusion is being done brilliantly well, and that's partly for a number of reasons. I think firstly, we lack, as we said in the beginning, the data that demonstrates it's being done in the first place. There's a lack of targets to ensure it's being done. There's a lack of accountability when it's not being done to enforce those targets. And I guess another thing is a bit, going back to your advocacy point, James, there's a lot, still a great lack about collaborating in the ground. When humanitarian actors are in the field, oftentimes, they're confronted with a large range of different groups, and maybe there are some that will get priorities and some that don't. So I think, it's very difficult. A small organisation of people with disabilities is not going to be invited to a cluster coordination meeting in a humanitarian response. However, humanitarian agencies themselves now are mandated to include persons with disabilities in their response. So I guess it's really balancing that mandate to include, and if it's done well, eventually, that we should see that change, reducing those inequities and hopefully redressing some of those inequalities that are there. But this comes back to the competition for resources. I've been doing work very pragmatically on access to assistive technology in humanitarian emergencies. Most people don't, it's not seen as a priority having access to assistive technology, whether we mean wheelchairs, crutches, whatever, but it's not seen as a priority. However, flip that the other way around. For people who need those devices, a lack of access to those can be life-threatening. If you can't hear emergency response systems, if you can't access, food or water or sanitation. So actually it can be life-saving in those situations. So I think it's really trying to understand how we have got much better. We've got the resources, we've got the guidance. Stuart says we've got the money. So it's really thinking what we still need to be doing, that last bit, to really ensure that we are achieving these things that we've set out to achieve and how we know we have achieved them. And I guess that's the tension here, isn't it? I still think there's a tension between the idealized response and the actual response.
Oh, thank you. Technology, assistive technology. Stuart, I was going to ask, do you think there's a lack of rigor here? We've heard quite a bit about failure to define standards and also about failure to make progress. Is that in some way explainable with a lack of rigor?
I do think there's a lack of rigor. Sometimes a lack of energy, and a lack of many things. Maria actually sort of opened up a whole bunch of things I think we can sort of explore a little bit now. But let's stick with the lack of rigor one at the moment. It's maybe not a lack of rigor, it's a little bit to do with leadership. And it's a little bit to do with our adaptability and our ability to, we're going back to efficiency now. And one driver of efficiency, I think, is trying to find innovative and creative solutions for the way we work. And I have to say, I don't think we're the most innovative or creative bunch of people. I'll correct that. I think we do have a lot of innovative and creative people, but we have a system which doesn't encourage innovation and creativity. We also have a system which is incredibly hierarchical within the UN, or each UN agency is very hierarchical. So things have to always go up to the highest level of the UN representative in your agency before you can move forward on these things. So this slows us down a little bit in the way we work because we're always waiting for the guidance. And it's also limiting in the fact that it's again, most of the UN agencies, how they incentivize leadership and how they incentivize good programming and good response. And there isn't a system in place which rewards people for being creative and innovative, particularly at the senior level. If you make 10 decisions, for example, and you make 9 extremely good decisions, and then one of them may have been a good decision, but it didn't turn out well, that is remembered, and you are penalized for that. You are not rewarded for the 9 good decisions you made. You're not rewarded if you're creative and you're innovative and you come up with a completely new way of doing things and it fails. Or maybe it doesn't fail, maybe it's just not perfectly executed. You're not rewarded for that. There's a system in leadership now where it's prototyping, it's called, where you basically try something, and if it doesn't work, then you take the lessons from that and you try it again and you make it a little bit better and keep retrying until it's really, really good. I do think in the system where we work, if you try something and it's not particularly good, then we just move on and do something different. And the person who decided that gets remembered. So there's no incentive to be creative and to be innovative within our system. And that's holding us back. The other thing, Maria also mentioned something about assistive technology. I would maybe even take out the word assistive from that and talk about technology. We are not the greatest people in the world at absorbing new technologies and utilizing that and supporting that. And one of the reasons for that, again, it comes back to leadership and the hierarchies, where we are senior. And when you talk about senior leadership in the UN, it has two meanings. One is senior, as in you are up at the top of your career. The other one is senior, you are quite old and you don't have the ability to absorb the technological advances and to utilize it in the way that it could be. We are getting better at that. We do have very comprehensive information management systems. We have very comprehensive assessment methodologies that we use, and that helps us a lot. But there's two different ways to do that. It's good to have those advancements, but with the drive for donors to try to get more sort of scientific evidence and data behind what we're doing, because they're accountable for how their money is spent. So they need to have it really sort of evidence-based. But it doesn't pick up the nuances. I mean, back when I started my career, we would go to, if we wanted to know what was affecting a community or what their main community concerns were, or get a message to them, we'd go to the church, because that's where people would go. And verbally messages could be delivered. And we would listen and hear what people are saying from the community. But that doesn't collect data in a scientific way as much. So that's kind of been dropped, and that's disappointing, because they're the nuances. And one final point before I drop this back to you, and going back to the theme of more with less. One thing that there's a clear way that we can do this, and this is driving a localization agenda, because working through local partners is way cheaper and arguably much better than going through the UN agencies, who tend to be very sort of distant from the communities we work with now. That wasn't the case 20 years ago, but now we do. Afghanistan is an example, an extreme example. For the last 20 years, we've been working from compounds and very rarely going out and sort of meeting people. Somalia, another example on that. South Sudan, another example on that. It used to be better. We used to be closer to the people. We've not really capitalized on localization and the efficiencies that can bring. And that's a disappointment, and something that is tangibly something we can work on.
Indeed. Do you agree, James? Has humanitarianism gone deaf? Evidence-based practice, very, very important, I would have thought, and it comes from medicine in origin, of course. But is the evidence being used in practice?
In some places, yes. Elsewhere, no. I don't think, in many of the places humanitarian organizations work, I don't think it's about a fundamental lack of evidence. I think often organizations know what they want to do, what to do. There are some places where the evidence base is incredibly poor. And there we're sort of, with knowledge generation, writing chapters as opposed to sort of crossing T's and dotting I's. But I mean, I was at an event not dissimilar to this shortly before COVID, and we were talking about the intersection between migration, displacement, and health, and talking about the protection of civilian sites that have now been reclassified in South Sudan, and thinking about MSF's work in these places. We're talking about a basic lack of clean water and simple sanitation facilities, and then research that's looking at, frankly, very simple interventions, hand washing, access to soap, and so on. I mean, there's a disconnect there. So I think, yes, there are evidence gaps, and how to bridge them is working with communities affected and with the responders that are working in those contexts to generate evidence that best meets the needs of people in those places, or the actual problems.
I'll just proceed here with one other thing. We've got two things here. We've got the very simple and the very sophisticated, namely, have they got enough soap, or do they use artificial intelligence, or do the agencies use it, or whatever? What do you think about the application of higher technology in this field? Should it wait until we've done the simple stuff, or is there room for it now?
I think I'm going to upset a few people in the room with this. I don't think we can innovate our way out of humanitarian crises. I don't think we can innovate our way out of the sort of the violence and intentional exclusion that so many millions of people are experiencing. And I think, you know, in several of these places that humanitarian organizations are working and have worked for a very long time, we're talking about basic needs that are not only not being met, but are very intentionally not being met often. So yes, I think certain innovative approaches, technologies have potential, but again, I mean, Tom Scott-Smith, to name drop this fella a second time, I mean, he's written a lot on the limitations of an innovation-driven kind of mentality in the humanitarian sector. And I think, yeah, that's something that resonates for me, at least, his work on that.
Well, we've got then evidently needs that are very intentionally not being met. That, of course, implies politics. So what do you all think about the relationship between humanitarianism and politics? Maria, would you like to start?
Gosh, yeah, would I? I mean, I think it's unavoidable, as James said. You know, we've seen already, we've had examples this morning, you know, some places where we know that whether it's a political decision how you label people, whether they are officially refugees if they've crossed an international border, or whether they're deliberately not given that status and therefore not able to access the same rights as everybody else for a political decision. So I think it's unavoidable, but I want to come back a little bit on what James said. And I think there is a space, you know, Anne talked this morning about the global prioritization exercise that ERA have been doing, looking at that evidence gap. And I think that there's a way to kind of mediate some of these challenges. You know, there's a lot of data being collected by agencies, you know, the UN included. There's an awful lot of local data. People have mobile phones, you know, they can collect, there's some really good evidence of where people are doing very simple, you know, updates on using mobile phones. And I think some of the nuances that we struggle with maybe when we have large scale data sets can be gleaned through these more innovative techniques, working with local people. And I think that can redress some of those political barriers, and it can also perhaps address some of the information and data barriers. So I think we've just got to think differently about the types of data we're asking for, the types of evidence, who we partner with, how we use it. And I think in coming back to the advocacy point as well, that will also help build up, you know, look, we might get evidence and data so X number of people have or don't have resources in this place. And in the end, it will still be a political decision whether those people are going to get it. But at least we're building up an evidence base. We can build up an advocacy case. And I think that's where innovation, different ways of thinking about how we collect data can help, you know, at least push back on some of those political decisions. I'm not sure we'll overcome all of them, but at least push back a little bit.
Stuart, how political do humanitarian agencies need to be?
I think they need to be very political. When you asked the question a few moments ago, it sort of triggered my mind back to something I was asked to do 2 days ago from a student, probably a similar student to the people who are sitting in the room, who had developed a survey asking questions about humanitarian principles. And I opened the survey and started to fill it out. And it was really sort of straight. Do we need which is the most important principle? And a lot of people have written about this. Hugo Slim, I think most of you probably know Hugo, has written about this a lot. That humanitarian is not principled, and it never has been principled. We are always making compromises, and I think that's true. And in order to make the right compromises, we have to understand what the political environment is. And this moves to something that Maria was just mentioning there, in the sense that we have lots of data, we have lots of information. In Turkey, where I'm working at the moment, we have some like 250 assessments in our assessment registration database. There's a huge amount of information there, but we're not great at analyzing that information. And this is one of the criticisms I have, again, of the humanitarian industry, that we do have the information available to us, but we're not exercising a great deal of foresight. One of the criticisms that we're facing here in Turkey now, it's not only the UN, it's the Turkish government, is that we weren't prepared for this earthquake, this massive, massive earthquake. And the first day that I arrived here, somebody showed me a seismic map with all the tectonic activity. And it was quite clear. that this is a place that should have been prepared for the earthquake. They had one in 1999, which devastated the country. But this is something that it had been followed up with the Turkish government, but things got derailed a little bit. But from the UN perspective, nobody had really worked effectively on emergency preparedness, despite the fact Istanbul is one of the homes of OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. The regional office, sort of a headquarters, is there. But we had really dropped the ball on emergency preparedness. And this is a lack of foresight, a lack of thinking into the future. And I think this also taps into the idea that we should be engaging in disaster risk reduction activities a lot more. Disaster risk reduction, resilience, preparedness. We're moving towards the environmental issues. We're looking at climate change, which I think we've been here for 36 minutes on the call, and we've not mentioned climate change in humanitarian yet. All of these things which are changing the environment. And it's good that they're on the radar, but similar to issues like disability and inclusion, the gender marker, which was something that came up a while ago, localization, elderly people, etc., etc. They're things that we're talking about, but we're not really integrating them into our practical action. And again, it's taking a step forward. This also goes back to doing more with less. It's not just doing more and serving more people. Humanitarian coordinators, resident coordinators, the leaders of the operation are now being asked to do a lot more than they were 10 or 20 years ago. Their job has got so much more difficult, and it's almost becoming quite unmanageable. And that's a challenge for people in operations, especially at the leadership level, and especially in a hierarchy where we have to wait for representatives or deputy reps to make decisions when they have 120 decisions to make in a week. So yeah.
So James, where is academia in this? Surely it could do quite a bit of the donkey work for the agencies.
Yes, to an extent. I think academia is only as useful as it is connected to organizations that are active and engaged. And I think there is a lot of that connectivity. Organizations that are pressed to respond, or who are primarily responders, often have limited time. They're stretched. Several colleagues at MSF who sort of tell me, they don't have time to sort of stop and think necessarily from one day to the next. And I think that's where colleagues in academia who are interested and engaged on these issues can add some serious value by helping organizations think through some of these tough questions, answer unanswered questions, bridge knowledge gaps, and so on.
I'm quite struck by this idea that you need to embrace more and more and more disaster risk reduction, good recovery, and so on and so forth, with less and less money, relatively speaking. And by the way, I've got on my hard disk right there a copy of that map of seismicity of Turkey, and it dates from 1967. If that isn't space for foresight, I don't know what is. But how then can the humanitarian system adapt to a situation where it is asked to do more, where people are already at their limits, puffing and blowing with no time to stop and think, and yet you're required to branch out into what once at least were other fields than simply reducing suffering when it happens?
Yeah, I think, I think when I was the focal point for disability in 2010, we had 19 cross-cutting issues. So I don't think this is a new, as Stuart keeps saying, this isn't a new debate, really. These issues have been there for a long time, really. So, it's really trying to think how do we distill them down, and how do we really address that? And I guess one way is to think more about, we bandy about terms like localization very easily, but I think actually having genuine partnerships, genuine collaborations with people who are in the affected areas, affected countries, I think that has to be one of the the best ways we can move forward on this. And really, we heard it already in the presentations this morning as well. Genuinely thinking about, asking different questions, maybe they're not always the right questions, but at least they're different questions, bringing perhaps increasingly, non-typical humanitarian actors into the space can also just make you think differently about this. I think, as I think Stuart alluded to already, you know, humanitarians get set in quite a particular way of thinking, and sometimes you have to have challenges to that way of thinking. And so I think having a much more glib, though it sounds, a localization agenda and bringing really working together with affected populations in a much more consistent and much more genuine, or partnership collaboration would be one way.
Stuart, what is the situation now with the big humanitarian players and local NGOs in the affected countries?
Not so bad, I don't think, but it can improve significantly. When I say not so bad, probably nearly all of our implementation goes through national NGOs. So we have a very strong relationship. We talk to them, they're the people on the ground with communities. But I think what the limitation of this, or the criticism of this, is that we are not engaging them in a sort of as equal partners. We're using them as subcontractors. It's you're on the ground in the dangerous places to do our dirty work, because either we don't want to go to these dangerous places, or we're not allowed to, because again, UN's Department of Safety and Security have increased or limited the ability of us to work more closely with the communities. So we utilize local NGOs, but we utilize them a lot. And I think there's a lot of work that we can do to try to integrate them more as equal partners. And that's similar to what Maria was saying, sort of building up their capacity to operate as a functioning NGO with a management board, with the ability to report to donors and the ability to receive money directly from donors. But I also should sort of throw a word of caution into this, because I think sometimes we're not thoughtful enough in our desire to do the right thing and to move forward. So the World Humanitarian Summit, the Grand Bargain, identified this goal of 25% of donor money should go to national NGOs directly. It sounds like a great idea, but we also have to sort of balance that with the last time we utilized national NGOs in a similar way, maybe not the last time, but one that strikes my mind, was in Somalia, in the southeast, in the areas controlled by Al-Shabaab, because we couldn't go there. So we had to, the UN agencies had to put a lot of money into the hands of national NGOs and do remote management. And apparently, statistically, 20% of the funding that was delivered just simply disappeared at a minimum. So we also have to be a bit wary that when we do engage, we have to sort of ensure that the taxpayers' money has to be protected at the same time. But I think the ALNAP report on the state of the humanitarian system, I think it said something like 1% of donor assistance goes directly to local organizations. Now, even despite what I said about the example in Somalia, I mean, 1% is dismal. We have to be increasing that. It's an embarrassment, in fact, that only 1% of international donor assistance is going to national NGOs. I want to throw a word out to a system that I think does work very well, not beyond criticism, but does work well, and that's the Federation, the International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent, where they do have sort of an international structure through IFRC, and they have the national societies all around the world. It's the biggest volunteer base in the world, I believe. And their function is, when there's an emergency, where there's any situation, IFRC will send some international staff, but the whole purpose is to work directly with the national society. And it works phenomenally well in many places where I've seen it. Where I am in Turkey at the moment, Liberia before in Ebola, you had the national societies that were treated respectfully. They had a lot of independence. Sometimes the IFRC thought they had too much independence. But they were there on the ground. They have the volunteers, which have the community engagement, and it's a very, very good model that I think can be capitalized on.
James, is this what you see in the health sector, particularly considering that MSF was effectively founded as out of frustration with the Red Cross movement?
To an extent, I mean, well, firstly, it's a myth of sorts, the MSF sort of founding story, and it was only sort of several decades later that MSF really grappled with the identity that it wanted to embody. But I mean, yes, there's partnership there, I guess, but as we've just discussed, it's about the substance of those partnerships. So you know, we often, I mean, MSF collaborates extensively with the Ministry of Health. Again, this was another myth of sorts that organizations like MSF were worked in isolation or preferred to work in isolation, which is in some places still often the case. But those networks and partnerships are there. It's about the issue is more fundamentally about the value and quality of those relationships, and that is fundamentally about who is willing to concede power, and generally speaking, people with power don't want to concede their power. And that's why we haven't really seen the shift towards, in any meaningful way, the rhetoric of localization, in my opinion.
It's an interesting point. You know, some years ago, I think about 2017, I read the book Aid on the Edge of Chaos by Ben Ramallingham. Very decadent. I actually read it on the beach during the summer holidays, but I didn't much like his solution, but I did like his diagnosis. And it makes me wonder, well, some seem to say it's come to the end of the road or nearly there. It can't have done because the need is not going to go away at all. But where is it going to go? Where do you think that the humanitarian sector will go, given the turmoil in the world, all of the political issues involved in this, the funding situation, and more?
Considering we're starting a new MSc in humanitarian policy and practice next year, I have to say that I think that there's much. This will be a debate that isn't going away for a while yet. I don't think that, you know, it's a hackneyed phrase to say if we try to set the UN up now, we wouldn't be able to, right? But is there an alternative? And you know, it could certainly be better. Structures could be better, delivery mechanisms could be better, etc., etc. We've talked about that today a lot. So I don't think it's a system that's going anywhere fast. There's a lot that could be done to improve it, a lot of questioning, a lot of accountability. And I think, you know, having voices like Ben's and other critical voices are good. I think that's partly the role of us as academics, right, to make those criticisms. And, you know, we can be one step removed perhaps from it and make those criticisms. So I don't think it's going to go anywhere, because I don't think there's necessarily a better solution yet. That's not to say there might not be in the future. Yet.
Stuart, if you had a lever, could you move the world, or perhaps you're already doing it?
Could you repeat the question? I didn't catch that.
Really, it wasn't a question at all. I'm simply wondering where you think the sector is going. If you had a lever, could you move the world, or are you already?
If I had a lever, I would love to pull it. And the way I would pull it is, I think we need to be have a really honest review of how we work and how we operate. We don't have a great amount of honesty in our system, I think. And again, this comes back to the business process, that decisions are related to money. And that hinders the ability to just step back and have a completely no bars hold type of approach to how we look at ourselves. But it would be great if I had a lever, I would pull that lever and have an honest review of the system. A couple of other things that I think would be really, really good to do is to try to integrate a lot more youth into the leadership of operations. So you get a blend of sort of more energetic and creative thinking alongside the experience that exists there. I think that would be good. I think UN systems should try to be a little bit more sort of creative in their thinking and less hierarchical and structured and more nimble and flexible, but I think that's very difficult. And one of the things that Harry,
can I stop you? Why is it
difficult? Why is it difficult? I think it's really difficult because everything is so ingrained in the mindset. it's very difficult to pull people out of the way they've been thinking, the way they've been working for 20, 25 years. It's also a level of ego within the system, where you have people who have been in the system for 20 or 25 years. They are not great at listening to other voices because they've always been used to, I am the leader and this is what everybody else should do. And that's the hierarchical structure. Yeah, there's so many systemic issues there that are blocking a sort of more creative way forward.
James, do you think we're going to wriggle our way out of this?
I want to say no. I hope perhaps, but possibly no. I mean, I think maybe just to advance sort of Stuart's reflections, I think what I see as the sort of future of humanitarianism is the decline, if it has not already, I mean, if it has not already declined already, the death of liberal humanitarianism. Several people have written on this. And arguably the death of liberal humanitarianism is something we should celebrate. What we need to be thinking about is the sort of a pluriversality of humanitarianisms, and this is something that again several scholars, practitioners are reflecting on now. That different forms of humanitarianism, which all exist already. Hugo Slim has talked about resistance humanitarianism in relation to the formulation of different types of response or different activities in Ukraine. You could argue that isn't humanitarianism at all. That's solidarity work. That's justice-driven work. That's an overt expression of politics. It's something else. But for me, it's the end of liberal humanitarianism and the emergence or the recognition of a pluriversality of humanitarianisms, and that in order to facilitate that transition, there needs to be recognition of, as others have mentioned, sort of the value of and the existence of a pluriversality of perspectives. And I think we can do our part in enabling that by reflecting on, who sits in these sort of fora, who's afforded a platform, what sort of narratives and positions are amplified, and so on when we're having these conversations. It's an abolitionist perspective of sorts, destruction, and then something grows out of the embers, I would say.
A little bit of what you said reminded me of liberation theology as well. But now that's very interesting. Clearly there is a need for some kind of radical change, but there are also going to be radical developments. So what do you think is going to happen when, for example, climate change really gets to bite, with more serious meteorological disasters and the possibility of unplanned mass migration on a very different scale, if anything of the sort does occur?
I think it's already happening, isn't it? We
Yes.
already started to see that. I don't think that's, I mean, I really like this idea of resistance in another context. We've done some work on this. I think, the idea of making communities resilient kind of implies that if you're not resilient, it's, we've built you up to be resilient. If you're not resilient, it's kind of your fault, and who's going to get blamed for your lack of resilience. And I think so a pushback around that to sort of resist that, I think we're already starting to see pushbacks around loss and damage. And I think that's something we'll increasingly see a pushback to to slightly shift this, this onus on the, always the most affected are the least likely to have any power to resist. So I quite like the idea of the resistance humanitarianism.
Interesting. So where are we going, Stuart? So where should we go? Where can we go in the light of things like climate change?
The simple answer is I don't know. We've known about climate change for a long time. We've not really adapted to this. Again, we have a lot of conversations about this. It keeps coming up on what's called HNPW, Humanitarian Networks and Partnerships Week in Geneva. We always have Paul Knox-Clark, if you probably know him, sort of hosting a panel and talking about climate change, and it's brilliant. But it doesn't seem to get that much traction, especially in the sort of the real world, which is an absolute shame because he's very sort of convincing when he talks. but it doesn't penetrate the system and it doesn't penetrate our thinking. And I've already talked about sort of foresight, looking to the future and looking at how things could go. And I don't see that we're changing and adapting sufficiently. No, in a normal world, if you're not performing and if you're not delivering, then there would be some sort of penalty. You wouldn't continue to get the funding, or funding would go somewhere else, or people wouldn't continue to buy your product if it's malfunctioning. But the donors still continue to keep coming back to the same UN agencies over and over. At the sort of more sort of country level, if we're talking localization, UN agencies keep giving money to the same national NGO partners. There's a big discussion at the moment that there may be 100 national NGOs in a certain country, but it's only ever the same 10 that get the money. The other 90 are left behind. So despite all the criticisms we've made in the last 1 hour, nothing seems to be changing in the system to address those. And yeah, we're not addressing climate change, but donors are still giving money to the same agencies that are not addressing the needs. And I think there needs to be a critical conversation amongst the donor nations about this, and how they're a little bit more, they need to be a little bit more aware of how the money is being spent and whether it is having impact and whether they're getting value for money. And I don't think they are particularly.
Interesting. James, do you think that the situation, that events are going to force change in the humanitarian sector, including climate change?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's a role for humanitarian organizations to play, almost a kind of canary in the coal mine sort of position, whereby organizations, provided they have access and they've positioned themselves appropriately, are going to see, are going to be at the very sharp end, or are going to be with, communities who are on the sharp end of the worst of what's to come. Changes like the climate emergency, pandemics like COVID have, I think, been major disruptors. And systems like the humanitarian system that is a reactive, sort of juggernaut. It's so slow moving that, as Stuart was saying, or I think Maria, the climate, we've been talking about climate change for decades and decades. We've known that this was the trajectory we were on. And only really in the last sort of 4 or 5 years have humanitarian organizations sort of entered into that conversation. So they're sort of the last to arrive. When humanitarian dialogue starts around an issue, that it's an issue that was kicking about 20 years ago. And I think now is the time for those organizations to, one, position themselves, so to be there as responders. And this comes back to the discussion we've been having throughout the course of today about what is within the humanitarian remit and is too much being expected of humanitarian organizations, and how do we adequately finance the response capacity, the acute response capacity, which is diminishing.
You would say yes, too much is being costed.
For sure, yeah. And as we were discussing earlier and during the presentation this morning, it really can't be a zero-sum game whereby the money that is being pumped into other aspects of the nexus is taken from the ability to respond to acute, immediate needs. And that's with all of the caveats about how problematic the notion of the humanitarian minimum is, and so on and so forth. But then I think humanitarian organizations have an important role to play by, it's an awful phrase, but sort of speaking truth to power, perhaps. Thinking very carefully about the language they use, the sort of values that they want to see shape this work. Talking about climate reparations, for example, being very intentional about the sort of changes that we would like to see, and that, of course, requires overt politicization of humanitarian organizations.
Well, this has been a very good discussion. I let it go on because it's been so fascinating. I wonder, though, to conclude, whether there are any questions, any burning questions from the audience. Like we have 3 or 4. Are we allowed to carry on a little bit? Or will that wreck the program?
Time for some questions, but I'd also like to note that Thomas Bamforth seems to have been able to join us online as well. So if you have any questions from the video from Northwest Syria, we could try to ask and see if Thomas is also available.
Well, thank you so much for this meeting. My name is Israel Balogun. I happen to be Dr. Maria's student. I'm also a person with disability and I've worked in the humanitarian space. My question goes directly to the panelists as a whole. How do we address some of the challenges that we face in the field? Especially I've worked in the humanitarian setting, whereby UN agencies, international NGOs are more like competing and hoarding some of this funding that they have for themselves. How do we address it?
Oh God. I think that was Stuart's point earlier, wasn't it, about trying to, the way the system is set, it is for competing funds. I guess it comes back to the donors as well, about, the donor accountability. And I don't know how you might change that, but it'll be interesting. This very week, today, in fact, there's a Ukraine recovery conference being held in London, and it's ironic that there's, I think there's some way to go before recovery happens, but I think the donors have to take some responsibility to shifting those competitions between organisations. I don't really see how else it would be done, but Stuart might have a different opinion.
Yeah, I think my opinion is the same. Something has to be done about it. There is too much competition and it undermines coordination. The answer, I think, there's probably many answers, but one of the key ones is the donors. And the donors repeatedly will continue to fund organizations doing very similar things in very, very similar places. And just bringing the sort of the different partners who are working on similar issues together to coordinate a little bit better would be an idea. This was supposed to happen through the cluster system, but some places it works okay, some places it doesn't work so well. There's another suggestion that I would have on this. I've always found it a bizarre situation when, let's say, an agency implements a project, and then pretty much with every project you implement, there will be monitoring and evaluation of the project. But very rarely do we have sort of independent evaluations on the project. So let's say, as a pure example, not naming names here, but if UNICEF have implemented a project, UNICEF will then hire somebody who will evaluate the success of that program. Potentially a third party, but that third party is usually a consultant who is employed by UNICEF to do it. And if he wants to get another job with UNICEF after that, he probably will want to write something positive. So the impartiality of evaluating the success of projects is really undermined by this practice that we have. And I've never understood why donors don't have some sort of independent process for evaluating how their money is being spent. So it will put a little bit more pressure on agencies to be accountable for what they do, rather than measuring their own performance. I mean, you would never get a Manchester United supporting referee to referee a game with Manchester United in it. It's a little bit similar to that.
What do you think? Anything to add?
I'm going to be cheeky and say I think part of the issue is that many organizations don't fundamentally care about what the evaluations show. And I think to your question, Israel, and this is perhaps a pessimistic one, I think competition will decline because the number of organizations active and engaged will diminish. That's what we'll see as we see, these attempts to do more with less, that organizations most likely will withdraw. And that in turn will have a positive impact of sorts on competition, but a hugely negative impact on response capacity.
Yes, I had a question actually. I'll jump in. Actually, it was particularly to Thomas, but others may have an answer as well. We talked a lot today about the nexus, humanitarian development peace nexus in a positive way. And Thomas, in your video, you mentioned that humanitarian response is really dependent on 6-monthly UNSC decisions, which doesn't sound positive at all. I was wondering whether you can talk a little bit more about a kind of nexus approach and how it might work better, or whether the UNSC should be involved in this way in the first place.
Thanks for your question. Can you hear me all right? Great. So great. Yeah, look, so I mean, Northwest Syria is a little bit of an unusual context because a lot of the work that takes place in Northwest Syria takes place across an international border. And because of this, although this is disputed by many NGOs and legal scholars, but the kind of prevailing UN view is that because it's assistance that takes place over an international border, then you need a Security Council resolution that provides authorization to do that. And that Security Council resolution used to be 12 months, now it's 6 months. And then all of the funding that comes through the UN system, through UN agencies, through the pooled fund, which funds many local NGOs, all of that has to be in the same time frame as the Security Council resolution. So you just get these 6-monthly resolutions and 6-monthly funding cycles. And that means that it's very difficult to go beyond that in this context where there's a clear need for longer term programs, longer term funding, longer term approaches, a bit more like a kind of nexus approach. You know, and I think the panel was also talking about climate change earlier. So we're dealing with a multiple simultaneous crises. I mean, there's the ongoing conflict, there's an earthquake, there's a cholera outbreak, there's protracted displacement, there's recent displacement, and then in addition to that, we have drought, incredibly hot summers, and unbelievably cold winters that was recently experienced during the earthquake, which hit in the middle of winter. And so we had even more people who were without houses in freezing conditions with snow and ice, -10 degrees and so on. And so in this context, the overarching humanitarian response to this, at least through the UN side, it's a little bit different through some of the NGOs, and it's a little bit different through some of the local NGOs and non-traditional donors. But that big chunk of work that comes through the kind of traditional donors is really on a 6-monthly basis, and it's really just totally inadequate.
I think we can take one more question. I'm beginning to feel a bit guilty about running over time, but we can take perhaps one more.
Thank you for the discussion. It was very fruitful. I'm just curious, you've touched about politics in humanitarianism, academia and humanitarianism. I'm just curious about how about the collaboration between humanitarian sector and the private sector, or even being the humanitarian organization being a private sector? Because although they have contradicting moralities, but they consciously or unconsciously, humanitarian organizations, they use like project management frameworks, supply chain, logistics and networks frameworks. How do you view that in the future of humanitarianism? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a purist in the sense that I mean, I feel very uncomfortable about that. But I guess pragmatically, as you say, I mean, they have conflicting moralities, and I think that's why I feel conflicted. Pragmatically, they are already involved in this space, very actively so. I think an important distinction, though, needs to be drawn out between humanitarian organizations using materials, using kind of logistical networks and so on, and the involvement of the private sector in other aspects of humanitarian response, for example, financing, priority setting, and so on. And that's the kind of the corporate creep that is pretty pervasive across the humanitarian sector now, and really needs to be curtailed.
Right. I think really we should stop at this point because we've gone over time rather. I would like to thank these splendid members of the committee for sharing their wisdom, which was very kind of you. And I'd like to apologize to you if any of my questions were too pointed or too intractable, as I suspect some of them were. But that perhaps is in the nature of the field. My last remark to these I started looking at humanitarian issues in 1981, having been involved with disasters for 43 years. And I started working for the Journal of Disasters early in that year, which had been founded by the London Technical Group, which was convened and existed and founded the journal in order to improve humanitarian practice, which was in a fairly poor state. For example, one of the things that it advocated very strongly through the journal and elsewhere was to have needs assessment when there were disasters, because there was none. Well, that clearly worked, because we not only have needs assessment, we have needs assessment fatigue even now. It swung the other way, but it nevertheless impresses me that there were a number of issues, for example, connecting disasters with disaster response and assistance with development, which were raised then, which had already been raised before, which were still raised. And as Stuart said, 1990s, well, clearly it took 10 years merely to get them onto the agenda. And decades later, they are still being discussed. Perhaps that also is in the nature of the system. But what we've seen then is a clear need for change, some good ideas about how the change ought to occur, but also some storm clouds that have gathered and started to produce some very serious rain. So let's hope the humanitarian sector can reform itself and that things will improve. But I trust that, like myself, we've all benefited from the wisdom of our panelists today, and thank you for being here. And thank you.
Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate that. And thank you to everybody who was able to join from online and in person. And in fact, we're not going to go over time, because all we're simply going to do now is wrap up very quickly. So I was going to aim to sum up the day, but I'm finding it quite a large task. So we started with a really excellent keynote speech that I think really placed us very well on the theme of the day. You know, we really saw numbers around need and numbers around funding, and to a certain extent, action and response. And we had 2 videos from people who are actively trying to manage this increasing level of need. And Leon and Thomas really added to our perception, I think, of today's topic and what is actually happening in the places that we're reading about in the newspapers these days or online. I think the panel took it in different directions. And thank you to Dr. Guppy again for organising such a diverse and interesting group of people. And I did feel like we cut that a little bit short. And if we'd had longer today, it would have been fascinating to talk more. And I hope that many of the panel members who are still here can stay for tea. If there are additional questions, perhaps we can further our discussions. And finally, the discussion now ranged far and wide, and I really think it was interesting to hear from academic perspectives, but also perspectives, again, from Thomas, but also Stuart, who really have a very deep understanding of what it's like to work in the system, and perhaps the weaknesses and strengths that they see every day. So, apart from going over each session, I'm not sure what to say in summary, except that the continued call to do more with less doesn't seem to be having an end date. I don't think, as David said, or perhaps I'm interpreting, that there is a solution to what we see as rising need, not only amount of need, but types of need. Who might be left behind, and how we choose in the future who to help and who not to help. Because I think that might be the key issue. So all I'm going to do is say thank you so much to everyone who was here in the audience and everyone who presented. And I'd like to just hand over very briefly back to our head of department, Professor Joey, to close the day formally, if she can get out of the seat. And thank you all again for coming to the IRDR Humanitarian Summit 2023.
Thank you so much, Lisa. So what have we learned today? Probably lots of things that we did know, but were so well articulated. The need for data, the need for evidence, but the need to analyze the existing data, not just collecting new data, the need to evaluate what we're doing independently, not just our own work, because we all believe everything that we have done has been fantastic. There was a very united message this morning, really interesting and different perspectives, but the need to engage, use, empower, strengthen, fund local actors, but doing so in a meaningful way and to get out over the barriers, the political barriers, the geopolitical barriers, not just from governments, but also from humanitarian institutions themselves, because they're seeking to keep on to the power they do have or the funding they do have and manage this competition for the limited funding there is. So how do we be more honest? How do we recognize the practices which are good and get rid of those which aren't? And in that last discussion, there was that desire to say, right, we've really got to sort out, we've got to analyze, we've got to critique, we've got to accept that some things need to go, some things need to adapt, some things need to move forward. And there was a plea from one of the panelists who works from the UN, so I think that comes with a little bit of gravity there, for non-senior voices. So again, I go back to our BSc Global Humanitarian Studies students and say, there we go, straight from the UN, they need your voices, they need you to be involved. So ready, it's been said to you, you're ready to go. And we'll also have other programs. We mentioned the MSc in Humanitarian Policy and Practice coming soon as well. So there we go. There's lots of people coming into this, new voices, new thoughts to try and tackle some of these problems that people feel have been around for a long time. So then people ask, well, what is it you want? What do we want to happen? I heard the word donor accountability many times, or words, donor accountability many times. But what I really want to happen is if we were to have this conversation again, let's say in 5 years' time, that it has moved forward, that we're not saying the same thing, that we're not saying, oh yes, but we were saying this 5 years ago, we know it's the case, you know, it's just a problem we can't solve. Let's hope that conversation really has moved forward. And as I say, that's up to the people in the room, that's up to the people online, that's up to the students, that's up to the entire sector. Let's move it forward. And I think, you know, it's been mentioned, those interdisciplinary perspectives, those intersector perspectives, different voices, different countries, local and national, you know, everybody working together and not in competition. We can do it. I'm the eternal optimist. I always believe it will get better. I have no evidence for this, but other than what David just mentioned, that he said things have got better, but it's fine because none of us care about evidence-based practice. You know, I can contradict myself there. It will get better. I really want to make a huge thank you to everyone who spoke today and people from the audience who engaged as well. Fantastic talks, fantastic speakers. It was a privilege to just sit and listen sometimes. A huge thank you to all the coordinators and those behind the scenes. I know you always hear it, but until you've tried to organize these things, you won't appreciate just how much work it really is. And particularly a huge thank you to Lisa. It has been fantastic. Everyone's been engaged and I know how much work it was and it is appreciated. So thank you, everybody. We now have tea, so enjoy your tea and see you again next year, or for those of you who are interested, our annual conference tomorrow, where we're looking at risk across borders or whisker about borders. And in particular, there will be a session for prospective students during the poster session. So I hope to see many of you tomorrow, many of you next year, and to collaborate with you throughout the year. Thank you.